Chapter 4. Do you need my address? Jack asked haltingly as a spasm went through his body. I already have it, Kaitlyn said confidently from the driver's seat. Dad looked through your wallet while you were out. Nice last name, by the way. The mocking tone in her voice was nothing new. Truth be told, he hated his last name. It had never caused anything but issues. For as long as he could remember, people had been making fun of his last name, and him by extension. Jack Rage, son of Jason and Eleanor Rage, with a younger sister by the name of Penelope. His entire family was a joke of terror-inducing proportions. He felt bad for his younger sister especially. It was bad enough for him. With her name, the nicknames Pen Rage or Penny Rage were just waiting to happen. Jack opened his mouth to respond but couldn't say anything as his back arched, fiery pain sweeping through his body. The light emanating from Chantel's healing hand grew brighter as he felt something shift within him again, then begin to rush out. She was drawing heavily on whatever power he had in order to heal him as quickly as possible. She was forcing the healing to such a degree that it was causing the healing heat to turn ever more painful. His whimpers filled the car as his back arched at an unnatural angle. Above him, he saw her smirk slightly before she forced more power into her healing. His eyes shot wide open as he began to scream. The car jerked to the side as the loud noise shocked Kaitlyn. A light provided by Chantel's healing magic lit up her face enough for him to see the harsh, malicious smirk that had spread across her face. A shiver rolled through his mind as he saw the almost evil glint in her eye. She knew that she was hurting him while also healing him at the same time, and she was enjoying it. In the front seat, away from the prying eyes of her slightly sadistic mother, Kaitlyn's face tightened into a white mask as the blood left her face. The whimpers and screams that filled the car behind her seat shocking her as she floored the accelerator, wanting this over as fast as possible. The burning heat that flowed through his body was concentrated on his wounded stomach and chin, gradually fell away. The healing was already nearly complete, leaving him feeling empty and exhausted in its wake. He had never had someone pull so heavily on his power before, and was unused to what the loss of magical power felt like. It felt like he had just sprinted an entire mile at full bore without breathing the entire time. His screams ceased as his hoarse and raspy whimpers replaced them. The pain was quickly fading, but the memory of it all was still there. If that was how she healed someone, then he never wanted to be in a position where he needed to be healed by her ever again. Unless he was dying, the pain was just not worth it. He felt the rumbles of the engine smooth out as the car slowed, and then stop as they arrived in front of his house. Kaitlyn climbed out of the driver's seat and opened the rear door next to Jack's head before helping him out. He leaned heavily against her, feeling weak all over after that intense and painful healing. His boots were placed around his neck by her mother at the last second. Holding most of his weight, she pulled him from the car and onto his family's front lawn. Closing the door to the car behind him, she gripped him tightly as they moved away from the soft growls of the engine. It was a good thing her mother had drained all of his energy. He didn't feel like getting flung across the yard from simply touching her right now. I'm sorry about that. My mom has a somewhat sadistic streak whenever she gets annoyed. She whispered softly to him as they walked across the dew-soaked grass. I annoyed her, he whispered back hoarsely. A snort of amusement rocked her body at his question. You ran out of our house when they were trying to explain everything. Then right afterward we had to rescue you, and she had to heal you all over again. Yeah, I'd say you did a good job of annoying her. He could see her smirking from the corner of his eye, most of his attention focused on walking. Right, I might have to apologize to her, he said with a wince. Not right away. I'd give her time to calm down. She helped him up the steps and to his front door before continuing. I'll see you again on Monday when I am transferred into your classes at school. After school is over for the day, you'll come over to our house once again. We'll explain everything to you in detail then. It might be a good idea to apologize to her then. He weakly lifted his head to look at her as he opened the door and leaned heavily against the door jamb. All right, I guess I'll see you then. The full import of her words and their meaning escaping him as exhaustion settled heavily into his weary bones. Letting go of his shoulders, she released him and stepped back. I'll talk to you more on Monday. There are a few things we should discuss before you see my parents again. Her voice was soft but firm as she backed away from him and ran back to her waiting car. Jack waited for her to climb into the driver's seat, her mom watching him with a small smirk from the back seat. Kaitlyn closed her door without looking back and then shifted the car into gear, leaving only a roar from the powerful engine and a thick pall of exhaust in their wake. Pulling himself away from the door, he closed it with a soft snick and locked it in his wake. Stumbling down the hallway, he dimly registered that there were no lights on in the house. He had gotten lucky that his parents hadn't awakened sometime in the night and found him missing. With that thought bouncing comfortingly in his mind, he opened the door to his room and shuffled inside. Closing the door behind him, he slipped his boots from his neck. His eyes were fixed on the bed, feeling an almost perceptible call from it. Falling into its sweet embrace still fully clothed, his mind said goodnight to the world. The dryness of his raw throat is what eventually pulled Jack from his slumber. His throat was so dry he had trouble swallowing, the breath catching in his esophagus, causing him to cough violently, as the still tender muscles of his stomach clenched. Sitting up in his bed, Jack reached weakly for the bottle of water that always sat next to his bed on the nightstand. Unscrewing the cap, he tipped the warm bottle of tepid water into his mouth, enjoying the feeling of the liquid flowing over the dry desert of his tongue. Each swallow hurt, his throat swollen and tender. The events of the night before had left him weak and exhausted. It had all been too much. Monsters were real. Magic was real. Not only that, apparently, he had some special kind of magic as well. One that made him a target. Everything was different now. Overnight, the very fabric of his world had changed. Things that he thought he knew had been proven to be untrue. Just thinking of the adjustment he would have to mentally go through was exhausting. The warm beams of sunlight coming through the window above the desk in the corner of his room attested to how long he had been asleep. The streams of light stretched far into the room, bathing everything in a golden glow. A knock on the closed door to his room encouraged him to swing his dirty, scratched and bare feet from his bed and onto the floor. Loud popping cracks echoed throughout his body as he stood and then stretched. A groan bubbling up as his sore muscles protested at the sudden abuse. Bare feet were not made for running on hard, rough surfaces, and that is exactly what he had done with them last night. No, he hadn't been running but sprinting. Going all out for minutes at a time while in an injured state. Just how much healing had occurred in the backseat of that car. Another knock came from the door, this one slightly louder and more insistent. Hurrying over to it, he flung the door open without thinking about his appearance. His younger sister stood there with her arm raised to knock again, her wide chocolate brown eyes lightening noticeably in his presence. Whenever she was near him, the color of her eyes had a tendency of turning into a molten caramel color. A scream ripped forth from her adolescent lungs as she stared at him with tears filling her eyes. The pounding of feet echoed through the house as his father yelled out, "Jack, what did you do to your sister?" "I didn't do anything. I just opened my door," he yelled back as his sister continued to scream. The pounding of feet drew closer as the diminutive form of his furious mother cleared the corner at a run. Hurrying to her daughter's side, her strawberry blonde hair trailed along in her wake. At 10 years old, her daughter Penelope was quickly catching up to their mother, Eleanor's height of 5'2". Eleanor's hazel eyes almost always had a honey-like coloring to them, from her long hair. Currently, those warm honey-colored eyes were flashing dangerously as she looked at her daughter's tear-lined screaming face. Her long hair flipped into Penelope's face as she spun to glare at her son. Jack had stepped back into his room in shock when his sister had started to scream. Her reaction was entirely unexpected, and more than a little disturbing. She seemed to be genuinely afraid of him. Then there was his mother, her glaring eyes widened as she stared at him. Behind her, Penelope finally stopped screaming as she brushed her mother's hair away from her face. "Jack, are you all right?" his mother asked in a wavering voice as she reached out for him. Stepping further back into his room, he avoided her questing finger. "What are you talking about?" he asked as he looked down at his chest where her finger had been reaching for. Seeing the torn and filthy remains of his shirt made everything click together in his head. He had been so tired when they dropped him off that he had fallen asleep without changing. The clothes he was wearing looked like they belonged on a slasher victim in a horror movie. His pants were covered in dirt and grime and more, from where his blood had fallen on them. His shirt was torn and discolored with stained blood and dirt from his various accidents during the course of the night. There was no telling what his face looked like, but he was sure it was also covered in dirt and dried blood. Is this related to whatever you were doing last night, young man? Eleanor stepped away from her daughter and crowded into her son's space. I know what time you got in this morning, and don't think for a second that we aren't going to talk about you being out all night. Her voice had dropped in volume, so it wouldn't reach her daughter's ears. Yeah, I was with Steve last night. We went to explore the old, abandoned school building on the other side of town. He began hesitantly, not daring to step away from her. What were you doing out there? Her eyes started to flash dangerously as she enunciated each word carefully. I have told you before that you are not allowed inside that building. And what does any of that have to do with the condition of your clothes? You're absolutely covered in blood, but you appear unharmed. So what exactly happened? Her eyes narrowed to tiny slits as she studied his face. His chin may have been healed, but all the blood from it was still smeared across his face and neck. There was no way he could explain to her what had happened the night before. She would never believe him. Heck, he barely believed any of it, and he had been there. He would have to tell her a small portion of it, and hope that did the trick. All right, I'll tell you. Geez, calm down, Mom. I'm unharmed and intact, see? He began moving his arms like noodles, trying to break some of the tension that had gathered in his room. His mother stepped back and turned to Penelope, who was still standing in the hall with wide eyes. Honey, go get a wet towel so your brother can wipe the makeup off his face. It seems he is already practicing for Halloween. Her voice was even and sweet as she spoke to her daughter, while Jack was mentally palming his face. It was only the middle of September. Why would he have been practicing doing makeup for Halloween already? All right, Mom. The relief in her voice that it was nothing more serious was obvious. Her brother was all right, and in the end that was all that mattered. Now you talk fast and explain what happened last night. Her voice dropped again, as the air around him seemed to become charged with electricity. And tell me, who unlocked your powers? A shiver ran through him as his mother's eyes began to glow. She knew about his powers, she knew what he was. She had powers of her own. Jack felt his mouth drop open in shock as he saw the change come over his mother. He licked his lips, closing his mouth as it began to dry out again. His heart was beating fast as he tried to form an answer. What do you know? Was all he managed to squeeze out in a dry, hoarse voice, before his sister ran back into the room with a slightly damp dark blue towel. She still seemed somewhat apprehensive of him as she passed the towel to their mother. Thanks, why don't you go eat lunch while I talk to your brother? She asked sweetly, keeping her glowing eyes fixed on Jack. All right, Mom. Do you want me to make anything for the two of you as well? Her voice was melodious as she walked back into the hall, heading for the kitchen. No, I think your brother and I will be heading out for a while. Her voice had taken on an almost imperceptible edge that her daughter completely missed. Don't forget that you still have some homework you need to finish, and I want you to clean your room as well. Behind his mother's back, he saw Penelope stick her tongue out at her before replying with a sigh. I know, I was waiting for Dad so he could help me with my math problems. She skipped down the hall and disappeared. Taking a step back, Eleanor thrust the damp towel into Jack's hand before turning to leave as well. Her eyes had stopped glowing before his sister had left for the kitchen. Talking to her daughter seemed to have calmed her for the moment. Clean yourself up and get changed. Make sure you're presentable. Depending on what you tell me, we may need to go see some people. She leaned against the wall near the door with her eyes closed. The frustration she was feeling at the moment could clearly be seen on her face. I've been trying to protect you from this for so long. Whatever happened last night just undid over 17 years' worth of effort. Opening her eyes, he could see them glinting with a hint of tears in the bright light. Just get changed and then we'll leave. Her voice was sad as she left his room. All the anger she had felt earlier had left her completely, leaving only feelings of sadness and exhaustion in their wake. Stripping his torn and filthy shirt off, he looked down at his chest and tossed the towel to the side. He was going to need more than that to clean himself properly. Grabbing some clean clothes, he hurried from his room and into the bathroom. Turning the water on hot enough to create steam, he stripped the rest of the way down and hopped into the shower. Letting the water stream over him, he let it soak his hair and run over his muscles, feeling them loosen from the heat. He hadn't even realized how tense he had been until just that moment. Unconsciously, his fingers trailed over the smooth skin where he had been pierced the night before. Soaping himself down thoroughly, he quickly scrubbed himself clean and turned the water off. Grabbing his towel, he noted the wisps of steam running over his skin as he began drying himself. Pulling on the clothes he had set out, Jack rushed from the bathroom and retrieved a pair of shoes. Slipping them on, he ran through the house, waving to his sister as he went through the kitchen. Through the window over the sink, he could see his father working in the backyard. He found his mother already waiting for him at the front door. She was dressed in a pair of tight jeans, worn brown leather knee-high boots, and a closed black fleece jacket. She said nothing as she looked him over before opening the door and walking out of the house. Jack closed the door behind them as she walked over to her car and slid into the driver's seat. He couldn't tell if his mother was mad or just preoccupied. She wasn't saying anything, and her face was carefully blank. For the first time ever, he was aware of an almost imperceptible air of power hanging around his mother. It was the same kind of feeling he had felt last night around Kaitlyn and her parents. It gave the air in the car an almost electric charge that, while new to him, felt familiar. Her eyes were glinting in the sunlight as she focused on the road, driving them through the town he had lived in all his life but suddenly no longer recognized. Last night had changed everything. It had introduced him to a world where monsters and magic existed. The bright deep blue sky was cloudless, and the air outside the car held the bite of fall in it. When he could hold it in no longer, he sighed in frustration and twisted in his seat to face his mother. Shaking her head, she cut him off before he could say anything. "Just wait, we're almost there and then we can talk." Next to her, Jack grunted in agreement and twisted back around to look out the window as the car sped outside the town limits and picked up speed.